Are you familiar with the Sino-Japanese War? With the modernization of the Meiji Restoration, Japan, then a small country gaining momentum through ongoing wars, defeated the great power of East Asia, the Qing Dynasty, and then signed the Shimonoseki Treaty in favor of Japan, ending the war. Let's take a look into these important series of battles that triggered the Qing Dynasty, a war that led to the subsequent Russo-Japanese War. 1871. Japan was then undergoing reformations influenced by the Meiji Restoration. Aiming for overseas expansion, Japan laid eyes on the Qing Dynasty, a leading power of East Asia, and sought to make relations with the country. This was when both countries concluded a treaty with another country for the first time after opening up their borders. Soon after, Japan signed the Treaty of Gangwa with Korea, a country also then under the strong influence of the Qing Dynasty. This treaty had many favorable conditions for Japan, such as gaining the right to freely use the coast of Korea. However, at the same time, it enforced the idea that Japan was to recognize Korea as an independent nation equal to Japan. However, the Qing Dynasty was not in favor of this treaty. The Qing wanted to keep Korea under their power and feared Japan's advance into Korea. Thus, they urged Korea to conclude treaties with Western countries and sought to make it harder for Japan to lay hands on the country. However, because of Korea's treaties with multiple other countries, a rise of recognition of Korea's independence occurred. Although Korea gained independence this way, the country was in great turmoil. There was a rise of dissatisfaction with the opening of the country under treaties with other countries, a rush of complaints of anti-Japan conservatives, and a call of anxiety towards rapid modernization. Meanwhile, in 1884, the Qing Dynasty, then in an unstable state due to the worsening relations with France, returned half of their troops stationed in Korea back to the country. Seeing this as an opportunity, Japan joined hands with the radicals to create a coup that justified the conservative government. This led to an establishment of a new government. However, it was only 5 days later when it was suppressed by the Qing Dynasty's military intervention, causing much casualty in both countries. The failure of this coup greatly reduced Japan's influence and power over the Korean government. In addition, Japan's envision of supporting Korea's modernization to compete with the Western powers collapsed. It seemed that this would lead to a war between the Qing and Japan. However, with the Qing Dynasty weakened by the war with France, and with Japan just entering modernization, both countries avoided each other's wars and instead signed the Treaty of Tiensen in 1885 to ease the tensions. Due to the treaty, both countries were expected to withdraw their troops from Korea within the next 4 months. When in need of sending troops to Korea, they were to notify each other's countries in advance and withdraw immediately after they completed their tasks. The Treaty of Tiensen was signed in this way. However, it was this treaty that later triggered the Sino-Japanese War. The rebellion seemed to have subsided, and it seemed that Korea had settled down. However, in 1894, the rural people of Korea suffered from poor living conditions. The price of rice and taxes soared due to trade and relations with Western countries. Thus, a movement to escape from Japan increased, and a rebellion by the farmers, the Donggek Peasant Revolution, broke out. At that time, the Korean government tried to suppress the rebellion, but the momentum of the rebel army did not stop, and it developed into a situation where all the provinces were occupied. Realizing that this was out of control, Korea decided that the situation was impossible to handle on their own, and requested military assistance from the Qing Dynasty. In response to this request, the Qing sent troops to Korea, complying with the Treaty of Tiensen with Japan and notifying them in advance. Upon the notification, however, Japan, fearing that the Qing Dynasty will increase its influence in Korea, sent its own army in the name of suppressing the rebellion. Thus, in June 1864, the Qing's army of 2,800 in Asan and a Japanese army of 4,000 in Incheon all gathered in place. However, ironically, by the time the troops were in place, the rebellion in Korea had already subsided. Both troops lost reason to be in position. Korea, which had settled their issues without military activity, demanded that both countries' army withdraw, but was rejected by both. Although both countries had come to stop the civil war in Korea, in reality, there was great tension between the two on which one of them would gain the power to dominate Korea. Thus, they were on the brink of starting a war at any time. Meanwhile, when asked the reason for rejecting the withdrawal, Japan wrote a letter to the Qing saying, "Let's proceed with the reforms of Korea's internal affairs jointly together. If the Qing refuses, Japan will do this alone." Still, the Qing rejected the offer. Upon receiving this answer, Japan sent the Japanese army, which had previously postponed its departure to Korea. Japanese soldiers 3 times the number of the Qing soldiers gathered in Incheon, ready to spark a war at any moment. However, on June 30th, it was Russia, also aiming for power over Korea, that had stopped Japan. Russia agreed to Korea's demands and urged Japan to withdraw its troops. Furthermore, Russia advised that if Japan did not accept this, the Japanese government would bear a serious blame. Although Japan was temporarily stopped by this, they continued to reject withdrawing its army and caused an even more tense state than before. It was 10 days later, on July 10th, that the Russian government, which had been focusing on Germany, ceased further efforts in dealing with Korean complications and issues. As a result, with Japan's obstacles out of the way, Japan finally makes a move. July 23rd, Japan marched toward the Korean royal palace, attacked and then occupied the area. Then, when the Korean ruler was put under control, a new administration was launched. The new administration demanded a withdrawal of the Qing army and created a perfect reason for the war. 2 days later, on July 25th, a Japanese battleship accidentally meets a Qing army cruiser while sailing around Toyoshima to join its own army stationed in Korea. The Qing army fired at the approaching Japanese battleship. This sparked the Sino-Japanese War. The battle off Toyoshima was completely won by the Japanese army in just a few hours. The curtain closed with the surrender of the white flag of the Qing Dynasty. No Japanese battleships nor soldiers were injured. However, the Qing had damaged 2 battleships and lost 1 battleship to Japan. Furthermore, on the 29th, Japan made a night attack on the base of the Qing Dynasty and completely suppressed it. It was during this attack that the Japanese army suffered some casualties and deaths for the first time, but the momentum of Japan did not stop. Asan, which was also an important base of the Qing Dynasty, continued to be suppressed. The Japanese army then launched an attack on the Qing troops of 10,000 in Pyongyang. As a result, the Qing shook the white flag and fled. This was a great victory for Japan. At that time, approximately 180 Japanese people were killed in the war, while the Qing is said to have lost more than 2,000 people. Then, on August 26th, as the war continued, Japan formed an offensive and defensive alliance with Korea. This war was to be a war for the independence of Korea, and the Korean army itself stood on the battlefield, promising supplies and transportation assistance to Japan. Soon after, when the Japanese army won the Battle of the Yalu River, they began the ship's strategic journey to seize and occupy bases one after another. However, the great numbers of massacres of civilians by the Japanese army was reported in the United States and in other countries and caused a great repercussion. Even after, the Qing dynasty's bases were controlled one after another, and the war continued at Japan's pace from the beginning to the end. And then, on March 30th, 1895, roughly half an year after the start of the war, the Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed, and the Sino-Japanese War ended with the victory of Japan. Under the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the Qing was to fully recognize Korea's independence and was prohibited from excessive interference. In addition, Japan was promised multiple lands, such as the Liaodong Peninsula, and a compensation of 200 million taels, equivalent to 300 million yen at the time, was made. At that time, Japan's national budget was approximately 80 million yen. Thus, we can imagine how enormous the compensation amount was. Now, that was the full story of the Sino-Japanese War. It was Japan's first big win after their overseas expansion, and an event that spread the West's awareness of Japan as a threat, and also an event that led to the collapse of the Qing dynasty. And on April 23rd, 1 month after the end of the war, Russia, France, and Germany, all under their own motives, joined hands and demanded that Japan return the Liaodong Peninsula. This is called the Triple Intervention. Japan will later reluctantly approve this request and give up the Liaodong Peninsula. This event will later lead to the Russo-Japanese War.